Breaking: Sadiq Khan is under fire as 9,000 historic grooming gang cases in London are being reopened, and critics say he's been covering up. It's a crisis that could shatter trust in City Hall, and the truth coming out may change everything. If you want the full timeline and real stories behind this, subscribe and stay with us. We'll break it down. At 3:17 p.m. London time, Scotland Yard confirmed a mass review. 9,000 child sexual exploitation cases, reported between 2010 and March 2025, are now back under the microscope. What happened in the next 15 years and what was ignored could shock the nation. For years, the warning signs had been there: scattered reports, fragmented testimonies, quiet allegations buried inside paperwork no one wanted to reopen. London had lived through waves of political battles, but this was different. This was about trust, safety, and the belief that the system would protect the vulnerable. Long before today's uproar, tensions were already simmering beneath City Hall. Reports suggest that senior officers had been pushing internally for a review of old child exploitation cases, some stretching back nearly 15 years. But the proposals stalled, redirected, or quietly dissolved in committee rooms. Every department seemed to point at another. Every delay blurred the truth a little more. And at the center of it all, whether he wanted to be or not, stood Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London. A figure both admired and criticized, praised for defending London's diverse identity, condemned by his opponents for what they called selective politics. But this was no ordinary controversy. This was a test of his leadership under the harshest possible spotlight. In the years leading up to this crisis, public trust in policing had already been shaken, from misconduct controversies to failures in high-profile investigations. Communities felt neglected. Parents feared that certain crimes were being avoided because they were too complex, too sensitive, or too politically explosive. But the number itself, 9,000 cases, was something no one was prepared for. Not the public, not the media, not even many inside the Met. It was a number heavy enough to pull the entire city into silence, heavy enough to demand answers from every leader connected to it. Sources claim that internal memos began circulating months ago, quiet hints that something larger was coming. Officers were instructed to revisit old files, re-interview previous complainants, and audit evidence that had long gathered dust. Still, nothing was said publicly. No announcement, no warning. Just a slow, silent tightening of attention behind closed doors. Meanwhile, political tension between City Hall and law and order critics intensified. Some MPs accused the mayor of prioritizing political harmony over difficult truths. Others defended him, saying he was doing everything possible in a broken policing environment he did not create. But the accusations kept coming louder, sharper, more personal. Then came the leak. A document, brief but explosive, listing thousands of cases flagged as potential mishandled investigations, began circulating among journalists. No names, no details, just raw numbers and an admission that these incidents needed urgent secondary review. That single document, according to those who saw it, read like an indictment of years of inaction. And within hours, the question shifted from what happened to who knew. Khan's office denied any cover-up. They insisted the mayor had ordered transparency, not avoided it. But critics claimed the review was forced only after whistleblowers refused to stay silent. And once the story hit the national press, the narrative exploded beyond anyone's control. London, a city built on movement, noise, and unbreakable energy, suddenly felt tense. Conversations in cafes turned to frustration. Parents demanded answers. Campaign groups called emergency meetings. Reporters crowded outside New Scotland Yard, waiting for even the slightest hint of what would happen next. And through it all, the one question echoed louder than the rest: how did 9,000 cases slip through the cracks of the nation's capital? The stage was set. The accusations were growing, and the reaction that followed would shake London harder than anyone expected. The news didn't spread slowly. It erupted. Within minutes of the announcement, a wave of disbelief rolled across London, first a murmur, then a roar. Phones vibrated on buses, office workers stared at breaking news banners, and families watching early evening broadcasts froze as the words 9,000 cases reopened flashed on screen. Outside New Scotland Yard, cameras clicked like rapid-fire drums. Reporters elbowed for position as a cold breeze dragged police tape against steel barriers, the plastic ribbons snapping in the wind like warning flags. The air felt charged, restless, almost metallic, as if the city itself understood the weight of what had just been uncovered. Then the reaction hit Parliament. Chairs scraped. Voices rose. Ministers spoke over one another until the chamber dissolved into a wall of noise. Some demanded immediate answers from the Mayor of London. Others warned against rushing to judgment. But the fury was unmistakable, sharp, echoing, impossible to contain. A senior MP was overheard saying, "If these numbers are accurate, this is the biggest policing failure in a generation." Another, visibly shaking, added, "Someone tried to bury this. Someone knew." The word spread like sparks through dry grass. Across the river at City Hall, aides scrambled. Footsteps clattered through corridors as advisors rushed in and out of hastily arranged meetings. Witnesses say the mayor's team looked tense, not panicked, but bracing for an impact no one could fully predict. Critics framed every movement as guilt. Supporters insisted it was the natural weight of responsibility. But the truth, for the moment, remained somewhere in the dark space between by sunset. Crowds had gathered outside both City Hall and police headquarters. Their anger wasn't chaotic, it was cold, focused, and simmering. Many held signs demanding justice. Others demanded resignations. A few simply stood in silence, holding pictures, grainy, creased photographs of daughters, sisters, friends, quiet symbols of the countless lives touched by the failures buried in those old files. A woman in her early 40s stepped toward a microphone held by reporters. Her voice trembled, but she spoke anyway. "We reported everything. We begged for help, and they let it disappear. How many years were stolen because no one listened?" Her words broke through the city like a crack in stone. In neighborhoods across London, in cafes in Bethnal Green, kebab shops in Southall, markets in Canning Town, people argued, whispered, pointed at screens. Taxi drivers tuned into live broadcasts. Teenagers scrolled through reactions on social media. Community leaders released statements demanding clarity. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Who blocked the truth? Who let these cases fade? As night fell, the streets carried a heavy quiet, interrupted only by the low hum of helicopters circling above and the rising chants from protest groups near Westminster. Reporters described it as a pressure cooker atmosphere. London, the city that never stops moving, felt stuck in a breath it couldn't release. Then came the public split. Some commentators insisted the mayor was being unfairly blamed for a decade of systemic failures. They said this was a policing crisis, not a political one. They argued he had inherited a broken system, one scarred by old decisions and outdated policies. Others were merciless. They accused him of avoiding the subject, of prioritizing community image over painful truths, of hesitating when action was needed years earlier. A former detective told a late-night radio host, "This didn't happen last week. This built up. Someone should have sounded the alarm long before." Pressure mounted with every hour. Government ministers demanded meetings. Opposition parties called for inquiries. Activists demanded resignations. And online, hashtags accusing the mayor of a cover-up trended at lightning speed, fueled by anger, grief, and years of bottled frustration. By morning, the city felt bruised. Outside schools, parents talked in hushed tones. On packed trains, commuters stared at headlines glowing on their screens. In living rooms across London, families watched footage of police vans, tense press conferences, and emotional interviews replaying on loop. Witnesses described a collective tightening in the chest of the city, a feeling that something enormous had slipped from the shadows, something too big to ignore, too painful to look at directly. And then, something unexpected happened. Members of the Metropolitan Police, some active, some retired, began to speak. Quietly at first, carefully, using careful phrases like missed opportunities, internal resistance, miscommunication, and political pressure. Nothing concrete. Nothing that confirmed anything. Just enough to feed suspicion. And enough to make London lean in closer. The pressure on the mayor intensified. Every word he said was scrutinized. Every pause was dissected. Every statement was measured against the fear, anger, and disbelief shaking the city. Yet one question echoed above all the noise. Whispered in newsrooms, shouted outside City Hall, murmured in taxis and living rooms. If 9,000 cases were neglected, mishandled, or overlooked, what else had been hidden? And by whom? By the time evening came again, London was no longer just reacting, it was demanding answers. And the confrontation that followed would define the next 48 hours in ways no one could have imagined. For nearly 24 hours, London had been spinning, crowds growing, accusations sharpening, and every major broadcast circling the crisis like a storm tightening around the capital. But nothing compared to the moment the confrontation finally arrived. It began just after 7:12 p.m. The sky was already dark. the Thames reflecting streaks of amber from the city lights. Outside City Hall, the crowd had doubled the tents, waiting, massive voices, banners, and cold breath rising into the night air. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, microphones angled like spears toward the glass entrance. Then the doors opened. Sadiq Khan stepped out, flanked by aides and uniformed officers. He looked tired, not broken, but worn, as if he had carried the weight of a million unanswered questions across his shoulders. Cameras snapped violently. The crowd surged forward. Someone shouted his name with anger, another with desperation. He raised a hand. A small gesture, but enough to silence the front rows. The mayor looked directly at the sea of flashing lights. A low hum of helicopters rolled overhead. And then he spoke. But the words weren't the controlled, rehearsed lines many expected. Instead, his voice came out steady, but wounded. "This ends tonight." The crowd stilled a sudden, unnatural pause over the river. He continued, the wind pulling at his coat as he faced the storm that had gathered around him. "For years, our city failed victims who trusted our institutions. And for that, I am deeply sorry. Not politically, not strategically. As a human being." Gasps, murmurs, sharp breaths, the sound of thousands processing his words in real time. "I did not cover anything up," he said. "But I also refuse to pretend the system I oversee has not let people down." The tension shifted. Some leaned closer, others shook their heads, arms folded, unconvinced. It was the most fragile moment of his political career, a moment where a single misstep could fracture everything. Reporters shouted questions. Did you ignore warnings? Why were thousands of cases left untouched? Was your office involved in delaying the review? Who is responsible for the failures? Khan hesitated, a pause so sharp it sliced through the air. Then he said something no one expected. "The documents released today are not the full truth." A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. Cameras zoomed in. The silence thickened. "There are internal records," he continued, "that I have requested to be released immediately. Records that show there were disagreements inside the Met, inside oversight boards, and yes, even inside City Hall. But they do not show a cover-up. They show a system tearing itself apart." Someone in the crowd screamed, "Where were you when it mattered?" He didn't look away. "I was here," he said softly, "and I should have shouted louder." The line hit the city like a punch, raw, human, imperfect. But what came next shifted the entire story. A senior officer, Commander Avery Rowland, stepped forward unexpectedly. His appearance hadn't been announced. Even some of Khan's aides looked startled. Rowland approached the microphones, cleared his throat, and spoke with the tone of a man fighting an internal war. "There were attempts," he said, "from multiple sides, to delay the review, to minimize its scope, to wait for politically calmer times." A collective gasp. He continued, "Those attempts did not come from a single office, or a single leader. This was interwoven pressure." The crowd erupted, half in rage, half in confusion. "Name them," someone shouted. "Say it," cried another. Roland's jaw tightened. "I can't." "Not yet." Reporters began firing off questions, the sound rising like machine gun bursts. But he pushed through. "What I can say is this. The mayor was not briefed fully. Not at the right time. Not with the right documents." Shock spread through the press line. Somewhere behind him, an aide put a hand over their mouth. Another reached for their phone, already texting frantically. Khan's eyes widened, whether in relief, frustration, or disbelief. No one could tell. Rowland looked out over the crowd and delivered the line that would replay across every major network for the next 12 hours. This was not a cover-up by one man. It was a collapse by many. The crowd exploded, shouts, chanting, arguments breaking out between groups. Protesters who had stood side by side all afternoon suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of the blame. One mother sobbed into her scarf. A man climbed onto a barrier and shouted that everyone was lying. A journalist whispered, "This changes everything." Khan stepped back to the mic. His voice was lower now. "If there has been wrongdoing from any office, any department, any command, it will be exposed. I will cooperate with a full independent inquiry, and I will face whatever comes." He paused, eyes scanning the crowd, seeing the pain, the distrust, the desperate hope. "Because tonight isn't about my career," he said. "It's about 9,000 people who deserved better." There was no applause, no cheers, just a heavy, aching quiet, the kind that follows a truth you never wanted to hear. But the night wasn't done. As Khan stepped away from the podium, a breaking news alert appeared on journalists' phones simultaneously. Screens lighted up. Eyebrows lifted. A low chorus of "Oh my God" rippled through the front rows. The alert contained a single chilling line. Internal memo leaked. Senior officials warned of political risk in reopening grooming cases as early as 2021. The crowd surged again. Reporters shouted frantically. Police lines wavered. Khan turned not toward his team, not toward the cameras but toward the river. For a moment, he simply stared across the Thames, breathing slowly, preparing for the firestorm that was now irreversible. The confrontation was over. The reckoning was just beginning. London did not sleep that night, not truly, not deeply, not the way a city rests when it feels safe. Instead, a kind of uneasy quiet folded over the capitalist silence made of headlights passing on wet roads, of late-night broadcasts replaying the same footage, of parents checking on their children twice before turning off the hallway lights. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was something heavier, something closer to grief. By dawn, the river looked still, almost glass-like, as if the Thames itself was holding its breath. But the city around it felt bruised, raw, and painfully awake. The events of the night before clung to the morning air like fog. Khan's trembling admission, Commander Rowland's unexpected intervention, the leaked memo that had swept through the crowd like a cold blade. For many, the night had ended with questions, but the morning began with something far quieter, an ache, the kind that spreads through communities when they realize something precious, something foundational has cracked. Trust, accountability, faith in the institutions meant to protect. In cafes opening early for the workday rush, there were no loud debates, only murmured fragments carried between tables. Did you watch it? He looked shaken. Rowland, I didn't expect that. God. 9:00. Some sat alone, stirring tea they never drank. Others scrolled through their phones, faces washed in the pale glow of new headlines. Mayor vows cooperation. Memo reveals political pressure. Families demand full truth, but no headline could capture what the city felt, that uneasy mix of sorrow and fury, of heartbreak and numbness. Londoners had always been resilient, but this wound ran deeper, touching something that couldn't be patched with statements or press conferences. Near City Hall, flowers began to appear, not for the dead but for the forgotten, for those whose voices had been lost in dusty files and closed-door arguments. A small girl placed a single white rose on the steps. Her mother stood behind her, arms wrapped tightly around herself, eyes locked on the entrance where the mayor had stood the night before. And in that quiet moment, it became clear this wasn't just a political scandal. This was a human one. Inside City Hall, the atmosphere had shifted. Staff moved with slow, heavy steps, speaking in hushed tones as if aware that every sound carried the weight of the city's disappointment. Some had cried the night before. Some hadn't slept. Some had begun packing personal items in case resignations came. But there was no talking about politics today, not openly. Today was about reckoning. Khan sat alone in his office before sunrise, staring out at the skyline. Reports suggest he didn't read the newspapers stacked on his desk. He didn't turn on the TV. He just sat, shoulders low, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the quiet river below. Witnesses say he whispered something under his breath, though no one could hear what. Perhaps a prayer. Perhaps an apology. Perhaps a question meant only for the morning light. Across the city, police precincts held emergency meetings. Officers reviewed files that hadn't been touched in a decade. Some stared at the faces of victims now grown. Others listened to audio recordings long sealed away. And with every passing moment, a painful truth reached deeper into the Met. This wasn't a failure of one office, or one mayor, or one department. This was a failure of silence, the kind that settles layer by layer, year after year, until the truth disappears beneath it. In Parliament, MPs arrived with circles under their eyes. The chamber felt different, less combative, more somber. For once, the shouting had stopped, replaced by something close to shame. Even political enemies exchanged quiet nods, the acknowledgement that some moments are too heavy for point scoring. And yet, even in the heaviness, there was something else rising slowly, painfully. Resolve. A determination that this time, unlike those before, the truth would not vanish into the archives. This time, the questions would not be buried beneath political convenience. This time, the victims would be heard fully, loudly, and without hesitation. By mid-morning, the city felt suspended between heartbreak and awakening. A group of teenagers outside a tube station argued about who was to blame. An elderly man on a bus wiped his eyes as he read an article about the leaked memo. A mother walking her child to school held his hand tighter than usual. Everyone moved through the day carrying invisible weight, and still, London kept moving not because it wanted to, but because it had to. The city had seen fire, terror, riots, grief, and always found a way to keep breathing. Today was no different. But the breaths felt slower, softer. A little broken dot as afternoon light cut through the clouds. The flowers on the steps of City Hall multiplied. There were now dozens lilies, roses, messages written in careful handwriting. They deserved better. No more silence. For the forgotten, and somewhere in the city, in a quiet room far from cameras and shouts, a single victim opened the letter she had written to herself 13 years ago. The ink had faded, the paper yellowed, but the words still held a tremble. Maybe one day someone will listen. Today felt like that day. Not because answers had arrived, they hadn't. Not because justice had been served, it hadn't. But because, at last, the silence had been broken. As dusk returned and the city lights flickered on, London exhaled a long, aching breath that carried both sorrow and hope across the skyline. The truth was coming, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. And years from now, when historians look back on this moment, this night of confrontation, this morning of reckoning, this day of raw reflection, they won't write about politics or polls or careers. They'll write about a city that finally demanded to be heard, about voices that would no longer disappear, about a quiet, heavy morning when London realized that healing begins not with answers, but with the courage to face the truth and the silence that follows.